One sentence was spoken in a boardroom. Clint Eastwood stood up from his chair, walked to the door without looking at anyone, and Hollywood still talks about that moment. It was 1993. Warner Brothers headquarters. Burbank, California. Executive floor. A mahogany boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the studio lot. 11 men in expensive suits sat around a table. One man in jeans and a simple button-down shirt sat at the far end. Clint Eastwood. He was 63 years old. He'd been making films for 40 years. Actor. Director. Producer. He'd built his reputation on two things: delivering on time and under budget, and never, ever compromising on what mattered. The meeting had been called to discuss his next project. A Western. Low budget by Hollywood standards. Small cast. Minimal effects. The kind of film studios were moving away from in the era of blockbusters and special effects extravaganzas. Clint had brought a single-page budget breakdown. He'd brought a shooting schedule. He'd brought the script, written by himself, refined over 2 years. He hadn't brought an argument. He never did. The executives had been talking for 45 minutes. Market research. Demographics. International distribution concerns. The phrase, audience expectations, had been used 17 times. Clint hadn't said a word. He sat with his hands folded on the table, listening. His face showed nothing. Not impatience. Not anger. Nothing. Then Bob Weinstein, Senior VP of Production, relatively new to the studio, 20 years younger than Clint, leaned back in his chair and said the sentence. "Clint, nobody wants to see old men on horses anymore." The room went silent. Clint didn't react immediately. He looked down at his folded hands. 3 seconds passed. 5. 8. Then he stood up. Not dramatically. Not with the scraping chair or slammed fists that mark anger in lesser men. He simply rose from his seat with the same economy of movement that had defined every role he'd ever played. He picked up his script from the table, tucked it under his arm, and walked to the door. Every eye in the room followed him. Bob Weinstein's smile faltered. The studio head, Gerald Matthews, half rose from his chair. "Clint, hang on." Clint opened the door, stepped through, closed it behind him with a quiet click. He didn't slam it. Didn't look back. Didn't offer explanation or defense or the courtesy of anger. He just left. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The 11 men sat in silence for perhaps 30 seconds after the door closed. Then everyone started talking at once, everyone except Bob Weinstein, who was staring at the door with the expression of someone who just realized he'd made a mistake he couldn't undo. Gerald Matthews, who'd been working with Clint for 15 years, put his head in his hands. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" "I just gave him honest feedback," Bob said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "That's my job." "Your job," Gerald said quietly, "was to green-light his project and stay out of his way. Clint Eastwood has made this studio more money than everyone in this room combined. He's never gone over budget. Never missed a deadline. Never caused a single day of drama. And you just told him he's too old." "I didn't say." "You said nobody wants to see old men on horses." "Clint Eastwood asked the old man on a horse." "That's not feedback. That's an insult. And worse, it's stupid. Do you know how much his last film made?" The room was quiet again. "Get him back," someone said. Gerald shook his head. "You don't know Clint. He won't come back. Not to this meeting. Maybe not to this studio." He was right. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Clint Eastwood was in 1993. And more importantly, you need to understand what he wasn't. He wasn't a diva. Wasn't the type to storm out of meetings over creative differences. Wasn't someone who made ultimatums or played politics or leveraged his fame for better deals. He was a craftsman. A filmmaker who showed up on time, knew every crew member's name, operated within budget constraints, and delivered quality work without drama. Directors and actors might make demands and create chaos. Clint just made films. But he had one immovable line: respect. Not for himself particularly. He didn't need anyone to tell him he was talented or important. Respect for the work. For the craft. For the people who'd been doing this as long as he had. Bob Weinstein's comment wasn't really about the Western. It was about dismissing 40 years of experience, decades of proven success, the value of a particular kind of filmmaking that didn't rely on explosions and CGI. It was about reducing a man's entire career to old men on horses, as if that were a punchline instead of a genre that had built Hollywood. Clint had heard worse over the years. Critics who said he couldn't act. Executives who said Westerns were dead. Industry people who dismissed him as just another cowboy actor who got lucky. He'd never argued with any of them. He just kept working. Kept making films that succeeded. Let the work speak. But there was a difference between criticism and disrespect. Between honest disagreement and casual dismissal. And Bob Weinstein had crossed that line without even realizing it. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Clint drove home to Carmel. 3 hours north. He didn't call his agent. Didn't issue a statement. Didn't do anything except go back to the life he'd built away from Hollywood. The quiet house, the golf course, the town where people knew him as their neighbor, not as a movie star. His agent called 2 hours later. Warner Brothers wants to meet. They're apologizing. They want you back. I'm not interested, Clint said. Clint, they're offering full creative control. Bigger budget. They fired Weinstein. There was a pause. They fired him? This afternoon? Gerald Matthews called it a restructuring, but everyone knows why. They want to make this right. Another pause. Longer this time. Tell them I appreciate it. But I'm still not interested. Can I ask why? Because it's not about Weinstein, Clint said. It's about what he represents. The whole room sat there nodding along while he talked about demographics and market research and audience expectations. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said, actually, Clint's films always make money. Nobody defended the work. They just sat there waiting to see which way the wind blew. So what are you going to do? Make the film somewhere else. He did. Took the project to Columbia. They greenlit it in one meeting with no notes. He shot it in 42 days, came in under budget, and delivered a film that would later be studied in film schools as a masterclass in economical storytelling. Unforgiven was released in 1992. It was the story of an aging gunfighter pulled back for one last job. A meditation on violence, redemption, and the cost of the myths we tell about the Old West. Critics called it Clint Eastwood's masterpiece. It won 4 Academy Awards including Best Picture and Best Director. It made $159 million on a $14 million budget. And it was a film about an old man on a horse. Away from the cameras, Clint made a choice no one expected. The night Unforgiven won Best Picture, Clint stood on the Oscar stage holding the golden statue. The Kodak Theater was packed with Hollywood's elite, producers, directors, actors, executives. Many of them from Warner Brothers, the studio he'd walked away from. His acceptance speech was brief. Thanked his cast and crew. Acknowledged the cinematographer and the editor and the production team that had made the film possible. Then he said something nobody expected. I want to thank everyone who believed this story was worth telling. Not because it was commercial or safe or guaranteed to succeed. But because it was true. Because it meant something. He paused. The audience waited. There's a lot of noise in this industry about what audiences want. What's marketable? What's safe? But I've learned something over 40 years. The only films worth making are the ones that matter to you. The ones you'd make even if nobody showed up to watch. Another pause. And I want to thank everyone who trusted me to make this film my way. Without notes. Without compromises. Without someone telling me I was too old. The camera cut briefly to the Warner Brothers table. Several executives shifted uncomfortably. Gerald Matthews, who'd fought to keep Clint, was smiling. Bob Weinstein's seat was notably empty. He'd left the studio 6 months earlier and wasn't invited to the ceremony. Clint held up the Oscar. This doesn't belong to me. It belongs to every filmmaker who's ever been told their vision doesn't fit the market research. To everyone who's been dismissed because they weren't young enough or commercial enough or safe enough. The standing ovation lasted 90 seconds. What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, forever. After the ceremony, in the private reception area, Gerald Matthews approached Clint. They shook hands. "I'm sorry," Gerald said. "About that meeting. About Weinstein. About all of it." Clint nodded. "You didn't say it." "No. But I didn't stop it either. That's almost worse." There was a long silence. Clint looked down at the Oscar in his hand. "You know what this really proves?" "What?" "That walking away was the right choice. If I'd stayed at Warner Brothers, I'd have spent 6 months fighting for every creative decision. Fighting to cast Gene Hackman. Fighting to keep the budget down. Fighting to shoot on location instead of on a soundstage. And the film would have been worse for it. You really think we would have interfered that much?" "I know you would have. Not because you're bad people or bad executives. But because that's how the system works. Test screenings. Focus groups. Notes from marketing. Death by 1,000 cuts." Clint set the Oscar on the table between them. "The film I made is the film I wanted to make. Every frame. Every scene. Every choice. That only happened because I walked away." Gerald looked at the statue. "So you're saying the best thing Weinstein ever did for this film was insult you?" Clint smiled. One of those rare, genuine Eastwood smiles. "I'm saying sometimes you have to be willing to walk away from the money and the comfort and the established relationships. Because the alternative is compromise. And compromise is just another word for giving up." He picked up the Oscar again. "Old Men on Horses. Hell of a film about old men on horses." The story of that boardroom meeting spread through Hollywood within days. It became legend. The kind of story young directors told each other as proof that you could stand your ground against the system and win. But the real impact was quieter. More personal. In the years that followed, whenever an executive started a meeting with market research or demographic concerns or what audiences want, someone would inevitably say, "Remember what happened with Clint?" And the room would get quiet. Because everyone knew what happened with Clint. He'd walked away. Made the film anyway. Won Best Picture. Proved that sometimes the market research is wrong and the old man in the room knows better than the young VP with an MBA. Bob Weinstein's career never recovered. Not because he was blacklisted or because Clint said anything negative about him. Clint never mentioned him publicly, not once. But because everyone in Hollywood knew he was the man who'd insulted Clint Eastwood and lost the studio its biggest prestige picture of the decade. Gerald Matthews retired 5 years later. At his farewell party, he told the Weinstein story himself. "I learned more from Clint walking out of that room than I learned in 20 years of executive meetings. Real power isn't raising your voice. It's knowing when to leave." Clint never returned to Warner Brothers. Never had to. After Unforgiven, every studio in town wanted to work with him. On his terms. No notes. No interference. No market research. He kept making films. Small budgets. Tight schedules. Stories that mattered to him. Some succeeded. Some didn't. But every single one was exactly what he wanted to make. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. 20 years later, a young director asked Clint about that meeting. About walking out. About whether he'd ever regretted it. Clint was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I regret staying as long as I did. The script for Unforgiven sits in the Academy Museum now. On the first page, in Clint's handwriting, is a single note. Trust the work. He did. And the industry never forgot.